Episode 9 of The Testminsters aired. Let's talk about it. Spoilers ahead. The episode opens up and we see the Pearl girls are cleaning up a bunch of blood on the floor. I overhear one of the aunts quoting, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand." And we overhear Daisy's inner monologue talking about how Gilead has a heart for vengeance. She talks about how Gilead takes the Old Testament quite literally, but how living in this environment, you kind of end up loving that type of vengeance because it gives you ideas, really reckless ones. We see Aunt Lydia and Aunt Vidala talking about how Commander Maddox, the guy that got Becca drunk at that ball, how he doesn't have any matches, and they're like, well, we'll just tell him next year, but maybe he won't live that long. But then they start overhearing the bell ring. Everyone gathers. Everyone's kind of confused because the Plums have all gone home. But then Daisy shows up, walks on that runway, goes up to the aunts and kind of tries to quote what everyone else has been quoting. But then she just ends up kind of saying, "Hey, I got my period." Lydia kind of laughs and she's like, "Tomorrow you're going to join the Plum." Next morning at school, we see Becca and Agnes talking a little bit. And Becca's like, "Hey, she's a spy. Daisy's a spy. All Pearl girls are. Just remember that." And Agnes is like, "You don't know her." And so we can see Becca's really, really jealous of Daisy and her closeness to Agnes because she's feeling this sense of distance between her and Agnes. Obviously, she's about to get married to Agnes's crush. The tension's weird. Things are off. Then the aunts show up and announce that Daisy is now turning into a plum. And all the girls gather together and give her new clothes, and it's like this little ceremony in itself, in a sense. And we overhear Daisy's inner monologue that her mother always said that purple was her power color, and she didn't quite know what that meant until now. Becca is asked to give her her pen, and she goes up and she intentionally kind of like pokes her with the pen. You get to see how these girls have no power, so they just kind of take what they can get, little moments there to kind of stick it to people they don't like. So as the girls leave the room, Agnes stops Daisy and she's like, "Hey, I thought you weren't going to tell anyone about your period. I thought you weren't going to disclose that." And Daisy's like, "Well, I kind of felt like I had to because it was going to come out eventually." And Shu is like, "Yeah, that's what I told you." And then Becca's like, "Wait, did everyone know except for me?" So this just further drives home how isolated Becca feels right now. She just feels completely disconnected from the rest of the girls. But then Aunt Esty stops her and tells her, "Hey, yeah, you're gonna go to the dentist this afternoon." And Daisy's like, "Wait, what, so soon? I gotta go to the dentist?" Like, "Yeah, isn't that great?" And so Agnes volunteers to go with Daisy because she doesn't have any family. Because obviously Agnes knows what happens at the dentist and she doesn't want Daisy to be alone. So we see the girls at the dentist in the waiting room, and Agnes and Daisy kind of hold pinkies. It's very sweet. And then the dentist calls her back. Daisy's just kind of sitting there expecting the worst. She's expecting this man to essay her. He ends up just giving her a cleaning, telling her that she really needs to floss, and then just kind of ends the appointment. So obviously Daisy has gone there in hopes that he would do something so she can announce it. But now she's like, "Okay, well, I guess I have to make it up." She literally looks him in the eye, starts ripping apart her shirt and screaming, and bursts through the door. And she just starts quoting, "Even in the valley of the shadow of death, I know he is with me." And she just keeps repeating that over and over again. And everyone's looking at him and looking at her. And poor Agnes is just kind of reliving a little bit of her own trauma. You see Daisy sitting before the aunt. And Vidala's like, "Well, you might be confused because, you come from Toronto." And Daisy's like, "I'm not confused. This is exactly what happened." And Daisy's like, "Yeah, I'm not from Gilead. I know sin when I see it." And so Lydia sends the other aunts away, but she asks Daisy to stay. You can kind of tell Lydia knows that Daisy's lying. She's like, "Isn't that so fortunate that he literally did that with so many witnesses around?" Daisy's like, "Well, lust makes people act recklessly." And Lydia goes, "Well, I thank the Lord for shining his light on the evil dentist," and sends her on her way. And we see Aunt Esty come up to Daisy and get on her hands and knees and ask for her forgiveness, saying, "Please forgive me for not protecting you. I'm so sorry." And we hear Daisy say, "Sometimes we forget that the aunts are people too." And so we can kind of tell out of all the aunts, Esty seems to be the nicest one, and she seems genuinely upset about what happened to Daisy. Daisy and Agnes are alone in the school for a moment, and Agnes is like, "Are you okay?" And says, "You're not like the other Pearl girls," because the Pearl girls would do anything to fit in. She's like, "But you spoke up and you don't seem to care that this could completely ruin everything for you." We see Agnes arrive home and she hides behind her bed and she's having like a panic attack. So we see that the events of the day really triggered her trauma response. She is dealing with a lot, and I think she knows she's going to have a really hard conversation with Becca later. We see that Commander Judd has shown up to talk to Aunt Lydia, and Aunt Vidala tries to stay in the room, but Aunt Lydia kind of shoos her away. And Commander Judd's like, "Yeah, I've heard rumors about Dentist Grove. We'll take care of him and you could have your pound of flesh moment." But Aunt Lydia's like, "Hey, can we wait a little bit until his daughter is married off? We don't want this to ruin her chances." And Commander Judd agrees to punish him after Becca is already married. Then before he leaves, he's like, "What a pity, he was such a good dentist." Later we see Garth and Becca and her mother sitting in the room waiting on her father to arrive. And Becca's father shows up and he seems completely frazzled, obviously from the events of the day. And he excuses himself, and obviously her mother's like, I'm gonna go check on him. And Becca seems very concerned, but Garth is like trying to make her feel better. So he's like, yeah, one time my father showed up in just the same exact way, and it turns out he just really needed to use the bathroom. And that makes her kind of laugh. But then her father comes back in the room with her mother, and he lets her know, yeah, so I was accused of this. It's completely baseless. You're gonna find out anyway. Becca knows exactly which Pearl girl he's referring to, and this just further drives home the fact that she really doesn't like Daisy, nor does she trust her. And so the next morning at school, she literally runs up to Daisy and pushes her. Are you trying to ruin my family, or are you just crazy? And Agnes kind of drags her away. Everyone's like staring at Daisy, and she turns around and she's like, sketch us, it'll last longer. Becca and Agnes outside, and obviously Becca's extremely upset, and she's claiming that Daisy's lying. Agnes is like, she's not lying, and Becca's like, how would you know that for sure? And Agnes discloses that she too was also hurt by her father. Then we see that the aunts have gathered Chu, Hulda, Becca, Agnes, and Daisy all together, and they're kind of being scolded for gossiping, being forced to say a prayer together. But obviously tensions are kind of high. And we see little glimpses of Hulda during these moments. I'm sure Hulda's also going through a lot of different things, a lot of different feelings, seeing Daisy also claim that she was also assaulted by the doctor. Later on, we see Garth standing by a car, and Daisy's kind of off in the corner, and she's like, hey, come here. Approaches her and asks if she's okay because he heard what had happened, and Daisy's like, don't worry about it, it's fine, nothing actually happened to me. I lied because he's been hurting other people. And Garth is upset at her for lying. Daisy's like, who else is going to protect these girls? And he's like, you need to follow Mayday's orders. And she's like, I'm not getting anything from Mayday. No one's telling me anything, so I'm taking it upon myself to do some stuff. Later on, we're back at Becca's home, and we see her sitting at the dinner table with her father and her mother, and she is silent. Her mother's just kind of blabbering on about the food that they're going to serve at the wedding, and her father's just staring at Becca. And finally he says, say something. And Becca asks him, did you do it? Her father is like, I didn't touch her. I didn't touch her at all. And we know technically he's telling the truth about Daisy, but obviously he did so many other things to countless other girls. So later on in the night, everyone's kind of getting ready for bed in their respective houses. We see Becca standing there amongst all the flowers. She has a pair of shears in her hand, and we see her go upstairs where her father's in the bathtub, and she attacks her father and unalives him. She's covered in his blood, and she leaves the house in a Martha's outfit, gets on a bus, and goes directly to Agnes's house. See Agnes's Martha wakes her up in the middle of the night, and she brings her into the bathroom. Becca's standing there, and she smiles at Agnes, and she's like, I did it. I unalived him for you because he can't hurt you anymore. And she said it was like divine justice. And Agnes, very concerned, is like, let's get you cleaned up. And so she puts her in the bathtub, and they're talking. Just keeps saying, I did the Lord's work. And then she starts saying how strange of a sound it was with the shears and everything. And then she tells Agnes, we should run away. Can we please run away together? And Agnes, lying to her, is like, yeah, we can run away. I'm gonna go talk to my Martha for a moment and get you some new clothes. So Becca's sitting there thinking, yay, I'm finally gonna get away from here with my best friend Agnes. Becca turns to Agnes and she's like, I would do anything for you. But as they walk down the stairs, we see that Agnes's father and her stepmother are down there, and Becca realizes, oh no, she's told someone. And Agnes is like, we're gonna take you to a doctor. You're gonna go get some help. But of course, that's not what happened. Garth opens the door and starts leading her outside, but then a bunch of people in masks start running towards her, and we learn that the eyes were called, and they start dragging Becca away into a van. Agnes turns to her father and she's like, I thought you actually called the doctor. I didn't realize you called the eyes. And so Agnes is now dealing with all this guilt as she watches Becca screaming for Agnes's help, screaming for help. Don't let them take me. Don't let them take me. But they put her in the back of a van and they drive away, and that's how the episode ends. We knew something terrible was going to happen with Becca because she's just been dealing with all this trauma. She's just been so miserable. She just wants to escape. She just finally snapped, and she thought what she was doing was right. She thought she was protecting her best friend. Now I can only imagine what's going to happen to her. This episode ended in such a painful way. What did you think of episode 9?